Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Julius Arscott. I'm an executive board member for the Ontario Public Service Employees Union and a leading member of Socialist Action. I'll be chairing this evening's forum, The Truth About Venezuela, sponsored by Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste. Socialist Action is an organization of revolutionary socialists across the Canadian state. We advance the fight for workers' agenda by building a class struggle left wing inside unions, inside the labor-based New Democratic Party through the Socialist Caucus, as well as in support of international solidarity, anti-war, anti-poverty, Indigenous peoples, feminist, eco-socialist, and human rights movements. SALAS is in solidarity with the Fourth International, with dozens of parties and thousands of comrades around the world. Year-round, we host film festivals, concerts, demonstrations, rallies, and educational conferences, many of which are in this room. We begin by acknowledging the stewardship of this land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. It is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, Mississauga of the Credit River. The territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wamput Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be able to work in the community on this territory. So tonight's forum is an act of truth and solidarity. We aim to look at the background to the current conflict in Venezuela and to stop foreign interference in the affairs of that country. And before I introduce our guest speaker, we actually have a special treat, a short spoken word performance by someone who has just recently come into contact with Socialist Action, Hajil, or Black Lotus. Hajil is a poet and a DJ, so welcome, Hajil.
My love, what are you afraid of? What do you have to lose? If you had a choice, what would you choose to do with your life? Sit back and wait, accept the poverty, the high cost of living, the war, the mental health, depression, the strife, or rise up and fight back, fight against the capitalism, the imperialist forces, like the situation in Venezuela, for instance, that we discussed tonight. There's never a time when we shouldn't fight. There's never a time when we should accept the darkness. For all of us can be a shining light. We cannot be passive. This destruction cannot be lasting. We must find a way to come together and let that solidarity never end. No matter what the news tells us, we can't pretend that we'll be giving the truth. We know the majority is lies, trying to pull the wool over our eyes. We know these governmental forces are going to come across as sheep. Of course, we know they're more like wolves, more concerned with oil than our rights as human beings. But our third eye is seeing it all. They're not fooling anyone. So let's all come together as one to fight against these materialistic factions. We can only do it with one mind, one heart, one voice, with solidarity, diversified in this socialist action. Peace and blessings. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right.
And I'm gonna stay as long as I can, which is gonna be probably for only another half an hour, only because I have an event tonight. So after you all get this knowledge from our dear speaker and everyone else who came to share, so we have a full enlightenment regarding this issue going on with our brothers and sisters, our comrades in Venezuela. You all can come and get a drink and attend a Lush party, which is now an open mic. So you want to share some of this knowledge tonight, come in and we'll give you 5-10 minutes to speak on it. Also party, so after 11 I'll be DJing with another DJ as well. But from 10 to 11 will be an open mic opportunity. So you have something you really want to share, you know, whether it be love poetry, something more political in nature, social issues, the environment, feminism, whatever is positive and uplifting, that's what we're about. And I'll have some flyers at the front door, and you could definitely attend. And just tell the door person that you're part of Socialist Action and you're invited by DJ Black Lotus. So it's just down the street at Floor and Dover Court, at Dover Courthouse. All right? So come through after this if you can. If not, tomorrow after his event, then you can also come to Utopia Cafe for some food and drinks, and I'll be DJing there as well. So both are on the flyer. But let's get back to the program. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Great. So, sisters and brothers, the leftist government of oil-rich Venezuela is under fierce attack by Washington, Ottawa, the global corporate media, and the Venezuelan oligarchy. Over 8 million people voted on July 30th to elect a Constituent Assembly to entrench the rights of the working class and to advance socialism. Who is responsible for the shortages, for the violence, for threatening to overthrow the elected President Nicolas Maduro? What should Canadians do, Canadians who defend popular democracy and self-determination, do about this? So our guest speaker this evening is Dr. María Páez Victor. She is a sociologist, born in and graduated in Caracas, Venezuela. She has an MA from the University of Kent in Canterbury, England, and a Ph.D. from York University. With many years of international experience in policy and analysis and environmental assessment, Dr. Victor taught at the University of Toronto and is chair of the think tank, the Canadian, Latin American, and Caribbean Policy Center. She recently returned from a visit to Venezuela. And I should also mention that we are honored by the presence tonight of Venezuela's Deputy Consul Omar Efrain Cruz Guevara, and by Consular Assistant Rudy Moscoso. After our guest speaker, we will hear from Socialist Action Federal Secretary Barry Weisleiter. Then we will open up the floor for any questions or comments, and we encourage participation. So now please join me in warmly welcoming María Páez Victor. Welcome.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this solidarity, which we greatly need. Now, I'm going to start off with a bit of a show and tell. I'm going to show you about 10 slides of pictures. Remember the pictures, because then when I talk, perhaps you will remember the pictures and make it more real to you. The opposition in Venezuela, I don't like to call it opposition sometimes, because when we talk about the opposition here in Canada, they're respectable people who aren't trying to overthrow the government of Canada, etc. But in Venezuela, they are insurrectionists. And what they did in the last 3 months was they stepped up a very violent protest to really try to bring the government down. You know that Venezuela has had a very tough time economically because of the fall of the international price of oil. And in this moment, when things were scarce, these terrorists burned 50,000 kilos of food.
Shame.
Here are some of the trucks that were burnt completely full of the things that the people needed. They torched all kinds of buildings, all public buildings and public brand new buses, things like this. And they attacked a maternity hospital. It's a hospital that only mothers go there to have babies. And that attack lasted 4 hours. They had to be rescued by the police and the firemen. You might have heard that a helicopter flew over the offices of the Supreme Court and dropped grenades on the Supreme Court. There was ecocide. Millions and millions of urban trees were cut because they used them to put barriers on the street. And the worst thing, I think, is the young men that they burned to death. This has never happened in Venezuela. We have never had civil protests of this sort. And they burned these young men because their skin was brown and they looked chavista. It was absolutely horrific. This is Orlando Jose Figueras. He was 21 years old. And you could see right there his death, actually. 2 guards. People were torn of their clothes and lynched. This kind of thing was happening. You probably didn't see this in the newspapers or on the CBC. They used fire as a weapon. You see these hoodlums, always with their faces, it's not working. Oh, I see. Oh, there, no, it's not working. Oh, there we go. Take a look. You see the gas masks? Do you think that there is a shop in Venezuela where you can go and buy a gas mask? They aren't made in Venezuela, you know. They aren't sold anywhere. Those come from abroad. There we go. Oops. Now here I want you to look at the shields that they have here. Those shields, white with a red cross, are the symbols of the Spanish Falange movement, which is the extreme right-wing fascist that started off in Spain a long time ago. And that's the symbol that they chose. Can you see where this is going? The fascist governments and movements in Spain and in Argentina, in Brazil, all these extreme right wings were the ones pressuring and doing this kind of thing. Here is a young man throwing Molotovs and missiles. They actually had these sort of flame blowers. They were the sort of a Molotov that actually propelled itself over quite some time. And if you think that the United States wasn't involved in this, in year 2013 and 2014, where we had also protests that were called guarimbas, just in that period, the United States gave $14 million to the opposition parties and opposition groups. This we find out through the Freedom of Information and when they present the budget to the Congress. Now this woman here in the center, her name is Liliana Tintori, and she is the wife of the terrorist Leopoldo Lopez, who is in jail. And he's in jail not because he's against the government, because he is the opposition. He's in jail because he incited violence, and because of his direct actions, 46 people died in Venezuela. This woman has come to Canada and posed as a human rights activist. I can hardly even say the words, it is so terrible. And look, she got to see Justin Trudeau. I can't get an appointment with my prime minister, but this terrorist gets to do that. And I am sorry for those of you here who are NDP, Mulcair was also taken up by her lovely blonde hair and her lies of being a human rights activist. We sent endless number of letters to the NDP saying, are you crazy? Do you have anybody there who speaks Spanish? Don't you know what you're doing? And there he was with this woman. We have a lot to do. This is Leopoldo Lopez, And I wish I had the audio here, because he is in jail because he went before the cameras, and he incited the crowd to go out and kill and do whatever. Now, do you think this is the face of someone who's talking about peace? I don't think so. So when the president called for a vote so that the Venezuelans can vote for their representatives for a constitutional assembly, all kinds of barricades went up so that people wouldn't be able to get out of their houses. And some of the buildings, and usually this happened in the middle class areas, they would lock the parking lots so that people wouldn't be able to take their car out. They threatened people they knew that were Chavistas. They, if we see you on the street tomorrow, we're gonna get you. This happened almost everywhere. These people right here were in a small town, and the paramilitary were there shooting at them so that they wouldn't go and vote. And some of the women said to the rest of the town, let's go across the rivers. And very quietly, hearing the shots of the paramilitary, the entire town crossed 2 rivers on foot. You can see a man here with a stick. He would go in front to see just how deep the water was. And this heroic town did this so that they could exercise their right to vote. The people really took to this. Right here, this says, we are a constitutional people and we are sovereign. I urge you to look up in the internet the Constitution of Venezuela, the 1999 Constitution of Venezuela. It's on the internet. And look up Articles 347, 348, 349, and you will see very clearly it says that the President of Venezuela has the right to call for a constitutional assembly. The opposition said, oh, that there were only 2 million Chavistas in Venezuela. They believe their own lies. 8.8 million people came out to vote. That was almost 42% of all voters. And they came out, and this is what I want you to think. Imagine if they hadn't had barriers to voting. How many more? How many more would have voted if they hadn't been intimidated and threatened? So I assure you, there's more than 8 million Chavistas there. This is a woman who's, because they went to where the election, the assembly was gathering. Millions of people went there, and he says, Maduro called for us to meet, and I am here at the National Constitutional Assembly because it is the way for peace. Let us make peace. They knew these are constitutional representatives who were chosen. Take a look, take a look. Their faces are the face of the Venezuelan people, the great variety and diversity. I will talk about the framework for the Constitutional Assembly because President Maduro gave out 9 specific areas for their agenda. It's not true that he called this Constitutional Assembly so that he would be president forever. They're always saying this. So we'll talk about these nine areas. And he is following Bolivar, and the ideology of Chavismo is Bolivar, and of course we're following Chavez. Chavez proposed amendments to the Constitution in 2005. We had a referendum and we lost that referendum. So Chavez's idea of of a constitution was not a constitution that was going to last there for 300 years, but he called it like a living document that needed to be amended according to historical moments. So it is not true that the Constitution of 1999 was something that was even conceived as something that was going to be written down in stone. So having shown you all the pictures.
Great. So you don't need the projector anymore? I can turn it off? Okay.
Yes. So as you know, the past 3 months have been horrendous for Venezuela, for its government, for its people. And let me preface anything I say to alert you to the fact that the entire situation of Venezuela is ultimately all about the oil. Who will benefit from it? Who will control it? Let me give you one data. It takes 45 days for an oil tanker to go from the Middle East to the oil refineries in Texas. The same oil tanker takes 4 days to go from Venezuela to the oil refineries in Texas. So the strategic importance of Venezuelan oil could not be clearer. The most extreme members of the opposition, the parties called Voluntad Popular, some of Primero Justicia, 20 Venezuela, Alianza Bravo Pueblo, who are led by the terrorist Leopoldo López from his jail, and his terrorist wife, who came here to Canada, Alfredo Ledesma, Freddy Guevara, and María Corina Machado. They were the ones who launched a wave of urban terrorism aimed exclusively at overthrowing the Maduro government. Now, the less extreme part of the opposition, Acción Democrática, COPEI, Un Nuevo Tiempo, the other part of Primero Justicia, Avanzada Progresista y Movimiento Progresista, with their silence, they followed their lead and tacitly accepted the strategy of violence. Never once did they decry this political strategy of their allies. Now, during these last 18 years, the opposition has fostered loathing and fear towards the Bolivarian government and its supporters, using the media, using the social media to instill emotions of rage and fear in people who normally would have thought and acted with sense. But it has been a profoundly racist and classist campaign against their own people. Now, I've just come back from Venezuela, and I spoke there with one person who's very well known to me. She opposes everything that has to do with Chavez, everything that has to do with Maduro. She insists that the government, not the opposition, has carried out all that violence that I showed you on there. All of that was done by the government. And it did not seem illogical to her that any government on this earth would want to appear incapable of protecting its streets from gunmen and arsonists. When I said, but it's illogical that a government would want to do this. Now, she is a typical example of how the upper classes of Venezuela have become blind to facts. They have suspended their capacity to think logically due to that intense rage that rules their thinking and their acting. This person, whom I believe has never in her life physically hurt anyone, told me with passion that she doesn't believe in elections and Maduro should be killed. And she's not the only one. Her words horrified me because they were filled with such hate and such lack of sense. Another well-known person to me begged me to please oppose the Constitutional Assembly because it would do away with elections in Venezuela forever. I pointed out to him that in 18 years there have been 20 fine elections, and that the US former President Jimmy Carter has stated that the Venezuelan electoral process is the best in the world. All of this quickly dismissed. It meant nothing to him. I was staring at the face of a true class struggle. Facts did not matter. Only the protection of their own interest, of their own lifestyle, of their own privileges and bias and class identity. To me personally, you know, you read and you study and you know this theoretically, but when you are confronted by people that you know and that you have esteemed and they act this way, it is actually quite terrifying. Now, these last 3 months, the opposition has been greatly stimulated and backed by that ignorant and erratic US President Donald Trump, whose Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is a former CEO, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. Now, this oil company is an avowed enemy of Venezuela. It did not wish to operate in Venezuela under the sort of legislated private-public partnership that all the other oil companies agreed to and are working in. It sued Venezuela for billions of dollars in an international court. And guess what? It lost. It is behind the push to take away from Venezuela the eastern Amazonic area of the Essequibo, where they hope to find oil. ExxonMobil is the world's #1 climate change denier. That has actually given millions of money to go around the world and buy people to say that there's no such thing as climate change. So, following the well-known regime change plans of the CIA that were so effective in the Ukraine, in Syria, in Iraq, there was this move against the government of Venezuela. It intensified precisely at the point when there were real economic problems due to the fall of international oil prices. During the years 2013 and 2014 alone, as I said in one of those slides, the USA gave $14 million to the opposition. Imagine the US hypocrisy. They cry foul about Russia intervening in their sacred election because Russia sent some emails. They seem to have forgotten that the USA has supported every single dictator in the hemisphere. They have invaded, deposed, or killed, or otherwise undermined every reformist politician that did not conform to their interest. I think the latest was Zelaya in Honduras, who was ripped out of his own home in pajamas and put on an American plane and bundled out of the country. So, thus backed by the Trump administration, the opposition carried out the following. First of all, the economic sabotage. There was the problem of the fall of oil prices, but on top of that, we had economic sabotage. And this involved anti-lobbying. They were asking, and they did, the leaders of the opposition in Venezuela asked international banks not to lend money to the country. They maligned the economy through the media. They openly asked foreign powers to intervene to overthrow the government. The president of the assembly, of the opposition, went to the European Parliament to ask that they intervene in Venezuela. They asked the government of the United States for sanctions for Venezuela. It's almost unbelievable that anyone would ask that for their own country. They fostered massive corporate smuggling of food and goods. It wasn't smuggling that, oh, I hid something in my car, or I put something in my bag. This was corporate smuggling in an immense scale. They fostered the currency manipulations of the black market and el dollar today. They promoted amongst the private sector massive hoarding of food and essential products. The army had to go around opening warehouses, and they would find, a warehouse full of frozen chicken and flour and sugar and everything, which they were hoarding, so that to tell the people that, oh no, there isn't this food. They armed poor youths. Those boys that you saw there, young men throwing the Molotovs, oh, they're not the precious sons of the well-heeled children of the upper class. These were young men of the poor classes who were given Molotov cocktails, the special missiles, the guns, the flamethrowers, and they paid them with the latest running shoes, with dollars. And what is worth much worse, they paid them with drugs. They barricaded the streets and the highways. This took place in the richer parts of the towns where the wealthy live. Why? Because they have opposition mayors. And the opposition mayors in those sections where the more wealthy live have their own police force. And the police force acted not to protect the citizen, but the terrorist on the street. Now, this is really important. Out of the 355 municipal areas of Venezuela, those protests took place only in 8 of them. If you just read the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, you'd think, oh, all of Venezuela is up in flames. No. Out of 355 municipal areas, in only 8 there were these protests. But they've got the ear of the international media. And they had the full force of that international media blowing up their reports. Their aim was to portray Venezuela as in chaos and ungovernable. And if it's ungovernable, oh, we must walk in there to help, you know, humanitarian boots on the ground. They burnt public buildings, including the maternity hospital that I showed you there. They threw grenades from the helicopter onto the Supreme Court. They lynched National Guards and men who looked Chavista. They committed the evil and outrageous crime of burning 5 young men to death because of the color of their skin. And by the 30th of June, this last week, there were 125 people dead. And most of these were supporters of the government or innocent bystanders. Now, in any other country, democratic or not, this urban terrorism would not be tolerated, and the perpetrators would be in jail. You remember Toronto about 3-4 years ago, how peaceful protesters were kettled, and hundreds were, simply put into jail without any kind of evidence, okay? So in any other country, this terrorism would just not be tolerated. This is not peaceful protest. Although the lackey international press insisted on portraying these people as students and as freedom fighters. The mayors who were elected by the opposition have their own police force, and these protected the terrorists. Now, this happened to me. I was a witness to this. I was caught in one of these protests just about 2 weeks ago. Our car, along with a whole line of cars, we were stopped by the police, who cordoned us off the road with the official yellow tape, that the police use. And they stood by like this, as these hooded and masked criminals staged their insurrection for the media cameras. And the traffic, we were stopped there for over an hour. Now, whenever a National Guard actually arrested, the National Guard is different from these police groups. Whenever a National Guard actually arrested somebody, the Justice Department would let them go the next day. It was full-scale impunity, and the people bitterly resented it and complained about this. They demanded justice. They kept on saying, why is this allowed to happen? Why is this happening? How can we allow it? The mother of Orlando Jose Figueras, whose death you saw on the screen there, was the first to be burned alive. And his mother went to speak to the Attorney General, Luisa Ortega. That Luisa Ortega, whom they talk about in the press here as if she was some sort of Nelson Mandela. I'll tell you what that woman did. When this mother went to her to ask for justice for her dead son, Ortega brazenly responded that she could do nothing because the video, those pictures that I just showed you, of her son burning to death, was a manipulation by the government of Maduro. She actually told this to this woman mourning her son who had just seen the charred body of her son. Said it was a lie. Now Ortega, since March, had closed the office of attention to the citizen. In other words, do not come here for justice. We're not even going to see you. We now know that she had been bought by the opposition because Liliana Tintori, the supposed activist for human rights, happily admitted this in an interview in Miami TV. This was just a couple of days ago. Ortega also lied blatantly to the Supreme Court. If any of you are lawyers or no lawyers, you know a lawyer cannot go before a Supreme Court and lie and have that lie proven. These were only some of her crimes that prompted the Constitutional Assembly to fire her. Now, what could President Maduro do? Let's think about, why did he call this Constitutional Assembly? What could Maduro do when he was faced with this grave situation? A situation that endangered not just his government, but the state itself. He was facing a war that was diplomatic, it was political, it was paramilitary, it was economic, and it was mediatic. It was taking place also in the media. International forces, in conjunction with the domestic wealthy oligarchy, were sabotaging the currency and the economy. The National Assembly, you see, the opposition won the National Assembly, it was led by the opposition, refused to legislate. It declared itself in insurrection, refusing to recognize the executive and the Supreme Court. And they declared, we're not here to legislate, we're not here to make any laws, we're here to get rid of Maduro. They said in 6 months, we're going to get rid of Maduro. The Attorney General, as I just explained, was working openly with the opposition to maintain a state of impunity with respect to urban crimes. Luis Almagro was using all his machinations to turn the OAS, the Organization of American States, against Venezuela with the help of the right-wing Latin American governments. He, fortunately, completely was unsuccessful. And may I add here a little parenthesis. One of the reasons, not all, but one of the reasons that Almagro was not able to put the OAS against Venezuela is because of the heroic small island countries of the Caribbean who were so loyal and really backed Venezuela. The paramilitary forces intensified their attacks along the western border with Colombia, with acquiescence of the opposition mayors and opposition governors along that area. And throughout all this, the opposition refused to negotiate. Now, this is very interesting. Last year, the opposition demanded that Maduro should negotiate with them, and many Chavistas would say, no, let's not give them anything. But Maduro, who was a very sensible man, said, yes, we have to negotiate. So he responded by setting up the table of peace and dialogue. And the facilitators were 2 Latin American ex-presidents and the ex-president of Spain. That wasn't enough. They demanded the Vatican. Maduro got on a plane, went, spoke with Pope Francis. Pope Francis immediately sends a nuncio. When the nuncio arrives, the opposition continued to refuse. Even if they had the Vatican there, they weren't going. Pope Francis himself said to the press that, and to the world, that the dialogue became impossible because the opposition refused to come to the table. You realize, when you've got enemies, you either kill each other or you negotiate. Politically, that's the only thing that you can do. Maduro did not have many options. Without a legislature, with horrible violence on the street, paramilitary attacks on the frontier with Colombia, an economy under siege, justice ministry promoting impunity and crime, and an opposition that refused to negotiate. This was the insurrectional interventionist chaos that the right wing of Latin America and Spain and North America and its European allies have visited upon Venezuela because they want its oil. And because they detest its anti-imperialism, its anti-colonialism, its Bolivarian democracy and socialist ideals. With a Bolivarian government, the petroleum would never be privatized. This is what kills them. President Maduro did not take the authoritarian route by declaring a state of emergency and suspending civic right guarantees, which is how Acción Democrática and COPEI, who were the 2 parties that governed the country for 40 years, that's how they would govern. Oh, there was a little something here in the street, somebody is protesting, we suspend the guarantees. They ruled for 40 years like this. At one time, I think it was Betancourt, he ruled for 2 years with the guarantees suspended. Well, Maduro did not do that. With great insight and loyalty to democratic and socialist principles, and exercising the authority given to him by Articles 347, 348, and 349 of the Constitution, he convened a Constitutional Assembly, the maximum authority of the will of the people. Following in the steps of the French Assembly in 1789, the American Constitutional Assembly in 1787, and the Russian Assembly of 1917. So this isn't just a one-off. He's following in great steps. There is, however, one big difference between the Venezuelan Constitutional Assembly and these other historic ones. Like the Venezuelan Constitutional Assembly of 1999, the members, the representatives of the assembly, do not represent parties or elites. The members of Venezuela's constitutional assemblies are citizens. They're not hand-picked elites, nor are they chosen by the parties. There were 545 who were to be elected, and from two types. 364 from electoral ridings. We call them territoriales because they are from a territory. And 173 from specific sectors. And I want to tell you what those sectors are, because this is really innovative. 5 representatives were to be picked from the business sector. 5. 8 from the rural workers, campesinos, and the fishermen. 5 from the handicapped community. This has never been happening before. 24 students. Can you imagine all that youth there? 79 workers. 24 from the communes and the communal councils. 28 pensioners. Again, this is very, very innovative that the pensioners got to vote. And 8 indigenous representatives who would be elected according to their own traditional electoral process. Now, the National Electoral Council, it's like Elections Canada here, right, was absolutely stunned and surprised by the great number of people who signed up to be considered as candidates. 54,414 people put their name up to be a representative. Can you imagine that? 54,000 said, hey, I want to be a representative. This in itself shows you the enormous desire that the people have to participate in politics and in this process in particular. Now, I had a slide there that showed the areas, the specific areas for the agenda of the opposition. The opposition was saying, this is so that Maduro can perpetuate himself in power forever. This is in order to eliminate elections, all these rubbish rumors. This is what the assembly is to do. First, to affirm justice, to guarantee peace, and isolate violent people so they can maintain peace. Second is, this is very interesting, to widen the economic system towards a post-petroleum economy and to protect against economic sabotage. Third, to make the misiones are these fabulously successful anti-poverty initiatives and programs that were established by President Chavez. And they want to make them constitutional so that if a new government comes in, they can't eliminate them. And then the justice system. They want a preventative penitentiary system, the war against impunity, terrorism, narco-traffic, and a more vigorous penal code against rape, kidnapping, and murder. 5, they want to give the communes and the communal councils constitutional status. Maduro is saying that he wants he urges the Constitutional Assembly to create the communal state. 6 is to defend the national sovereignty and protect against foreign intervention. The 7th is a new spiritual and cultural diversity of the Venezuelan identity. 6 is all due for the youth, for their social, educational, and cultural rights. And the last one is very interesting, climate change and the protection of life on Earth. So now the opposition, who did not want to negotiate with the government, now has to contend with the people. We will have to negotiate directly with the people of Venezuela through this assembly. Now the right-wing governments and the imperial governments screamed that all this was illegal. It wasn't. Anyone who can read the Constitution can see clearly and it unequivocally allows the president to call for this assembly. But note that these protests of illegality by these governments goes completely against international law. Those declarations by the US and by Canada violates the universal principle of the free determination of peoples. Countries are free to write their own laws as an expression of their sovereignty, especially, most especially, if this is done through an elected assembly. Now, international law is the only thing that protects any one of us from absolute chaos and war. This was a grave fault. I can understand it by the lunatic Trump administration do it, but I can't understand it, Chrysler Friedland doing this. This really goes against so much of Canadian traditions. Now, it's important to point out that Venezuela's right to elect a constitutional assembly is backed by the ALBA countries, by the Caribbean countries, by the non-aligned countries of the UN, which are 2/3 of all the countries in the world. And the UN, as a whole, also backed Venezuela's right to write its own laws. It was a brazen law to international law when Canada and the US declared that it was not legal. They know better. They know that's not true, but they are acting according to their own narrow interest, i.e. the desire to control the Venezuelan oil and the mineral riches. What is in dispute here? In this seemingly internal battle in Venezuela is the fate of all Latin America. Whom does its immense riches belong to? The minerals, the water, the oil that is in Latin America entirely. Who has the right to possess it and control it? Do you remember the water war of Cochabamba in Bolivia? Where they wanted to take even the water that was falling from the sky, they wanted to take it away from the people. Which domestic elites are going to benefit from the international marketing of such riches? How can the enormous population of the subcontinent be controlled? This is what this is about. It isn't just Venezuela. It's La Patria Grande. It's the entire subcontinent. The right-wing governments are terrified of their own people. I ask you, what would happen if the peoples of Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Paraguay, Honduras, Panama, Costa Rica, Chile, Peru, Spain, what happened? What would happen if their people decided they want what Venezuela has? They want to write their own constitution. Nobody asked these people about the constitutional changes their political elites contrived. The Mexican government, by the stroke of a pen, changed its constitution to privatize the once gem of their country, the oil company, Pemex, with not a single Mexican asked whether they wanted to do this. The USA, of course, is against anything that Maduro does to preserve his government, and sadly, Canada seems to follow cravenly in tandem with whatever the USA demands. Now, I personally consider that the hardest part of the agenda for the Constitutional Assembly will be the economic task. To try to protect the economy from sabotage, to setting the basis for a diversified post-oil economy. This is not easy or even perhaps feasible to legislate these things. The economy has been brought to its knees by runaway inflation, and that is a great conundrum. Yet, the amazing thing about this, the amazing thing about Venezuela, is that even 1/8 of such economic problems that it had would have brought down any government in the USA, in Canada, or Europe. Just an inkling of, unemployment going up, inflation going up, any of these things, it becomes a great issue in in election time and the governments come down. Yet despite the bad economic situation, the people hold fast to its government. That is truly remarkable. But of course, they're not idiots. They know that if the opposition ruled, their fate would be much worse. On July 30th, 2017 was a historic moment. The people of conscience, of courage, of integrity went to the voting stations and voted for peace. Despite the paramilitary bullets, the street terrorists trying to barricade them in, the entire rural town that evaded paramilitary bullets and silently waded on foot across 2 rivers to exercise their right to vote. There were many, many heroic stories that happened on that day. 8.8 million patriotic Venezuelans voted, almost 42% of voters. And just think how many more would have voted if the violent opposition had not been intimidating them and blocking their way. These extraordinary, ordinary people saved their country by establishing a constitutional assembly, and almost the very next day, the violent protest on the streets ended. Those who had bet on the road of coup d'etats, who joined hands with the imperial attack against the country, who accepted the dirty money of the Yankees to destroy the peace of their own people and the rule of law, were defeated totally and overwhelmingly. The opposition was left in disarray and having to confront not their wild desires, but the reality of the Bolivarian conviction of the people. Now already, the 20 opposition parties have declared that they will now take the electoral road and will stop the violence, which I'm very glad. But they're going to do this because that strategy did not work. I'm quoting them. Because that strategy did not work. They will stop the violence, not because it's immoral and evil, but because it did not give them the results that they wanted. Not even one mea culpa for the dead, the injured, the anguish, the millions of dollars worth of destruction did they do. What kind of an ethics is this? President Maduro has shown himself to be a grand statesman, a man who found the road to peace and justice for his people, despite horrendous odds, powerful adversaries, both internal and international. Now it's the turn of the 545 members of the Constitutional Assembly, genuine representatives of the people of Venezuela, to establish a constitution and a rule of law that truly leads to peace and justice by closing the legal loopholes to terrorists and to those who destabilize the economy and those who sell their country for a bunch of dollars. Have no doubts about it. The Constitutional Assembly of Venezuela is right now not just changing laws, it's carrying out a revolutionary cultural and political change that will have repercussions far beyond Venezuela's border. They are defining a new type of power, a new way of the people to exercise their will and their sovereignty, and they're ushering in the communal state, unleashing a new wave of political creativity that promises to sweep away the dialect of colonization, a new philosophy of the communes, and a firm positioning of the working class of Venezuela as genuine actors of their political body. The destiny of Venezuela is now in the hands of its people, as it should be. El bravo pueblo de Venezuela, the brave people of Venezuela. And I thank you for this meeting.
We have one more speaker. Barry Weisleiter is a teacher, union organizer co-editor of Socialist Action newspaper and chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus. He will focus on the role of the Canadian government and propose some